Okay, welcome back. This is the Larouche Pack Lincoln Series podcast. I'm the host, Mike Stager. Of course, our special guest is Bob Ingram, who is at the very bulk of this discussion, as people by now know. Number 6 is going to be the American system in action. So Bob laid out last time, and if people have questions on some of these things, the banking, the credit, the greenbacks, how this worked, Bob and I were just discussing it before this recording. Send questions to podcast@larouchenet.net. And I just want to remind people once again, part of this whole discussion and series is that there are major discussions taking place as the Biden-Harris collective fails. The zombie hypothesis of regurgitating dead politicians back into American life because no one else wants to represent this dying liberal system. As that fails, whether it's in El Salvador, whether it's Biden touring the Queen's palace, Queen Mum, as I guess he calls her, as this hypothesis fails, we are going to have to bring to bear, not in 3 years, but in the coming months, a functioning and competent government. And unless you're one of the small Americans that trust any person in Congress or even the Republican Party to run the country, you know that the responsibility is on you, the American citizen, to understand how we're going to run this nation, whether it's election integrity, which is taking place with the audits, whether it's foreign policy, how do we work with sovereign nations, not globalist corporatist interests, but most importantly to our country today, how do we reconsolidate our constitutional authority and deploy that towards real economic development? And on those two questions, and on all the rest, including foreign policy, there is perhaps no better example of a true American citizen than Abraham Lincoln. And so, Bob, we're going to jump into some of the applications of Lincoln's thinking into economics. So why don't you get it started, and we'll see how it goes.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Mike. Well, hello, everyone. As Mike said, the title of the podcast tonight is The American System in Action. Now, for those who have been following the series, last week we delved into Abraham Lincoln's greenback policy, his national banking policy, and the way in which he created a system of a national credit system, a sovereign public credit system. What we're going to look at tonight is what he did with that credit system. Now, as Mike alluded to, this has an enormous amount of relevance for the political movement we are building today, for getting the country out of the crisis that it's in. We have our hollowed out cities. We have rusted out industrial areas. We have, people working, tens of millions of people working at the minimum wage. We have rotted out and decaying infrastructure. We need to rebuild the productive capabilities of our nation. And that is exactly what Abraham Lincoln did in his time. So we're going to look at this a little bit. Fundamentally what we're looking at, one way you could describe it is the economics of development. The economics of development. And I would also remind people from what we had discussed in earlier weeks is that this all flows from Abraham Lincoln's deep-rooted commitment of the right to advance, that our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, is fundamentally grounded in the concept of human advancement, and that the Republic, as it is charged in the Constitution to protect and promote the general welfare for not only our current population, but for our posterity, for future generations, that we are constitutionally committed as a republic to pursue policies which will advance the productive power of our economy and advance the, the interests of the population. So that is where we're at. Now, before just jumping into it, I will tell you that I had an alternate title for tonight's presentation, which I was toying with. And that alternate title was How Abraham Lincoln Implemented Larouche's Fourth Law. Because one of the things we're going to be looking at tonight in a little bit of depth is the question of science policy. Not just the projects that were built, but this question of science. And for those who are familiar with Lyndon LaRouche's fourth law, or four laws, which he wrote and published in 2014, the actual title of that document was The Four New Laws to Save the USA Now. This was written in 2014. And in the fourth of those four laws, what LaRouche discusses is the urgent necessity for a science driver policy for the nation. And he doesn't just discuss this in terms of just a science driver. He develops an in-depth discussion of this question of human creativity as being and the question of science itself as being fundamental to human advancement and fundamental to the actual basis for our republic. That this is at the core of everything. And we're going to get into that tonight. So we're going to look at two things. One is what was built, some of the things that were built, some of the things that Lincoln did, and then we're going to get into the question of Lincoln and science. So to start off with, you know, what everyone always points to is the Transcontinental Railroad. You know, this was begun during the war. You know, while the war was going on, they were already beginning construction. They were mapping out routes. There were people working on this. You know, land grants were being made for, you know, where the routes were going to be laid out. And this continued, and it was completed in 1869, only 4 years after the, you know, after the war ended. Now, there are a lot of historians. I want to set the historical record straight a little bit. I mean, people may think Lincoln built the Transcontinental Railroad, which he really did. But there are a lot of historians who downplay this, who downplay Lincoln's role. And in fact, you can read biographies of Lincoln, even prize-winning biographies of Lincoln, where the Transcontinental Railroad is barely mentioned. Because what the argument is that, yeah, Lincoln was for the Transcontinental Railroad, but, you know, he really didn't have a lot to do with it. You know, that people were talking about building the Transcontinental Railroad back in the 1840s, 1850s, that geological studies were done in the 1850s, that a bill was introduced into Congress well, one of them was introduced in 1860, and I think there might have been one a couple of years earlier. But a bill was introduced into Congress to build the Transcontinental Railroad. There was a big debate going on in 1858, 59, 60 about which route the Transcontinental Railroad was going to be built on, and that all of this occurred before Lincoln was president. So, you know, the argument is that when he became president, he just sort of acquiesced to this, and, you know, because they now had a Republican who was a president who was in favor of it, they got to build it. Well, that's really wrong. That's not what that completely misrepresents who Abraham Lincoln was and his leadership role in pushing this project forward. Look, you know, in one of the earlier podcasts, I discussed Lincoln's career in the Illinois state legislature. this was in the 1830s, where he became the leader of the project to crisscross Illinois with railroads. And he was the leader of this. He was the one who fought for it. He was the one who traveled around and gave speeches. He was the one who introduced the bills in the Illinois legislature. And he really became known in the 1830s as, in Illinois as Mr. Railroad. And he really became known as the foremost proponent of Western railroad expansion throughout the Midwest and the West, in Ohio, in Indiana, in Illinois, in Wisconsin. Lincoln was recognized as the leader of the fight for Western railroad expansion. In 1831, when he was only 21 years old, Lincoln delivered a speech where he said, quote, "No other improvement can equal in utility the railroad." And even by 1831, he is fighting for this and saying this is of paramount importance, that we must do this. Now, bear in mind, when he gave this speech in 1831, railroads had only been in existence for about 3 or 4 years, and there were no railroad tracks in Illinois, 0 miles of railroad tracks, and 99% of the people in Illinois had never seen a railroad. And here's Lincoln saying that this is of paramount importance, and no other improvement, no other initiative can equal it in importance. So this was Lincoln's role right from the beginning. And by the mid to late 1850s, in 1857, 1858, 1859, when Lincoln was engaged in his law practice, he became the chief attorney for almost all of the railroads operating in Illinois, including he was the chief attorney for the Illinois Central Railroad, which by 1859 was the largest railroad in terms of mileage in the United States. And Lincoln was the chief attorney for that railroad. Now, I want to point to that in 1859, this is August of 1859, so it's about a year before Lincoln gets the Republican nomination for the presidency. And Lincoln had a meeting in Council Bluffs, Iowa, with an individual named Granville Dodge. And that meeting, what they mostly talked about, the reason why Lincoln sought out Dodge and, sort of, buttonholed him and pulled him away, and they had a lengthy meeting. And what they mostly discussed was the route for the transcontinental railroad. The pluses and minuses of different routes, and where it should be built, and the kind of problems they were going to run into. And later, to a friend, Dodge wrote a letter in which he described this meeting with Lincoln. And I'll read you a couple of short paragraphs from that letter. Dodge wrote, "Lincoln greatly impressed me by the marked interest he displayed in the work in which I was engaged, and he expressed himself as believing that there was nothing more important before the nation at that time than the building of a railroad to the Pacific coast. He ingeniously extracted a great deal of information from me about the country beyond the river, the climate, the character of the soil, the resources, the rivers, and the route. When the long conversation was ended, I realized that most of the things that I had been holding as secrets for my employers in the East had been given to him without reservation. We met on a high bluff known as Cemetery Hill, just north of the town. That's Cedar Bluffs, Iowa. He was greatly impressed with the outlook, and the bluff from that time has been known as Lincoln's Hill. From here, he looked down upon the place where, by his order, 4 years later, the terminus of the first transcontinental railway was established. So Dodge and Lincoln actually mapped out the terminus, where the eastern terminus of the railroad was going to start in Iowa, and that's how it proceeded. Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act July 1st, 1862, authorizing huge government land grants to finance the construction. 2 years later, he signed a second bill doubling the land grants and other financial incentives. Altogether, more than 45 million acres of land were given away for the railroad route. So, and throughout 1862, 1863, 1864, 1865, Lincoln is constantly intervening to clear obstacles, to move the thing forward. It was Lincoln who chose the eastern terminus. It was Lincoln who chose the route, the final route of the railroad. It was Lincoln who chose the gauge of the tracks for the locomotives and the rail cars and the rails. I mean, this was his project throughout his presidency. And Grenville Dodge, the person he met with in 1859, became the chief engineer for the Transcontinental Railway project. Now, the construction of the railway, I'm not going to go into a lot of things, but obviously rails, locomotives, they had to move through mountains, they had to build all kinds of structures. There were, if you think back to Lincoln's speech on discoveries and inventions, this project led into not just hundreds, but thousands of new inventions, new patents, pneumatic brakes, blasting materials, new types of steel, all kinds of things. Literally thousands of new inventions, thousands of new patents for the construction of this project. So that's all I'm going to say about it. Obviously you could have a whole class on the Transcontinental Railway project, just like you could on the Erie Canal or any of these things. But this is what the greenback policy, this is what the national banking policy, this is what a presidential administration together committed to this kind of project. This is what they were able to accomplish. This is what they built as a result of the government acting on behalf of, creating a productive, scientifically and technologically progressive intervention into the economy for, future generations. Now, the second thing I wanted, why don't we show those two pictures right now, Mike? Just briefly, just put them up, picture 1 and 2.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, these are both from the western portion of the Transcontinental Railroad. And this is the construction of, you see a trestle leading into the mountains. They're going through the Sierra Nevadas. And as people know, the Sierra Nevada mountains, the peaks go up to 10, 11, 12, 13, 14,000 feet. And this was the most difficult part of the railway to build. And this is a picture of a trestle going through the foothills, approaching the mountains. The next picture. And this is a picture of now abandoned. The tracks have been long torn out, but a picture of one of the tunnels they blasted through the Sierra Nevadas, to build the western portion of the railroad. So that's enough for the pictures. But they just give you some sense. I mean, they're not the greatest pictures in the world, but to give you some sense of the enormity of what was done. and this was done, in 7 years. And most of the construction really, they were limited by how much they could build. A lot of the initial stuff that was done during the war, was planning, mapping out routes, getting things ready, building some of the terminuses or termini. But most of the actual laying of the tracks was done between 1865 and 1869. So you're talking about a 4 to 5 year period of construction to build this enormous project. So the second thing I just want to talk about is the question of agriculture. Because, as I mentioned in one of the earlier podcasts, in 1862, Lincoln had signed the Homestead Act, which opened up massive amounts of land in the West for settlement. And, he was determined that this would not develop into, the creation of hundreds or thousands of poverty-stricken rural communities, just spotting the landscape all over these huge territories. He was determined that these territories had to be transformed with scientific agriculture. Now, one of the ways they were going to be transformed was through the Transcontinental Railroad, because you were, from the Transcontinental Railroad, other rail lines would be built. So you would be connecting all of these communities, to major urban centers, to the east, to the Pacific, to areas of more, densely populated civilization. But Lincoln knew that more than that was needed. Now, he created two things, one of which I spent some time talking about earlier on the question of education. He created the land grant colleges and the land grant universities. And these were, schools set up with government money by selling land grants. They established land grant colleges. Later, they developed into land grant universities in every single state. And the focus of them was scientific agriculture and engineering. Now, they had other things in the curriculum, but the primary two focuses were scientific agriculture and engineering. And these were set up everywhere. And the second thing that Lincoln did was, during the war, he created the Department of Agriculture. I want to read to you from a speech that Lincoln gave to give you a sense of his thinking on this. This is a speech he gave in 1859, September of 1859, so it's only about a year before he's elected president. And he gave this speech to the Wisconsin State Agricultural Society. And this is what he said. So he's speaking to an agricultural society. And he said, "I know nothing so pleasant to the mind as the discovery of anything that is at once new and valuable. Nothing that so lightens and sweetens toil as the hopeful pursuit of such discovery. For the mind already trained to thought in the country school or higher school, every blade of grass is a study, and to produce two blades where there was but one is both a profit and a pleasure. And not just grass alone, but soils, seeds, and seasons, hedges, ditches, and fences, draining, drafts, irrigation, the saving of crops, combating the pests of crops, diseases of crops, and what will prevent or cure them. The thousand things of which there are specimens, each a world of study within itself. In all of this, book learning is available. A capacity and taste for reading gives access to whatever has already been discovered by others. It is the key or one of the keys to the already solved problems. And not only so, it gives relish and facility for successfully pursuing the unsolved ones, for making new discoveries. And, then in May, that was in 1859, on May 15th, 1862, Lincoln signed into law the bill creating the Department of Agriculture. And in signing that bill, he said the following, in creating the Department of Agriculture. He said, to acquire and to diffuse among the people of the United States useful information on subjects connected with agriculture, to procure, to propagate, and to distribute new and valuable seeds and plants, to acquire all information by means of books and correspondence and by practical and scientific experiments, to acquire employees, to include chemists, botanists, entomologists, and other persons skilled in the natural sciences pertaining to agriculture. So that's the end of the quote. And what he's laying out is the mission of the Department of Agriculture. That what is intended here with the land-grant colleges, with the Department of Agriculture, is to create the most advanced scientific agriculture in the world, utilizing the best of what is already known, government support, bringing in scientists, bringing in professors into the land-grant colleges, and creating laboratories, because all of these land-grant colleges had laboratories and testing facilities where they were testing diseases, testing seeds, and making new discoveries, which would then further revolutionize agricultural productivity. So this was the second thing that that I'm emphasizing in terms of what Lincoln did. The first is the Transcontinental Railroad. The second is the revolution in agriculture and agricultural education. And then the third thing I'll just mention, and I'm not going to go into detail on it, is the protective tariff. This was passed in 1861. This was called the Morrill Tariff. Senator Morrill was the same person who sponsored the land-grant college bill. And this was the highest protective tariff in the history of the United States. We had high protective tariffs before, but this was the tariff, and it was actually increased again about a year or two later. So by the end of the Civil War, we had a protective tariff in which the average rate of the tariff was 47%. At the beginning of the Civil War, the average tariff charged for goods coming in was 18%. By the end of the Civil War, it was 47%. And what this did is this created, extremely high tariffs, high protective tariffs, which enabled, as we were building the things we needed to build for the war, as we were building the things we needed to build for the Transcontinental Railroad, as new steel mills, new iron foundries, new inventions, new manufacturing facilities, as these things were being brought online to build up our productive economy, they were protected from the British or anyone else dumping cheap imported goods in the United States. That we were protecting these industries, particularly in their infancy, so that we could build up and increase the nation's manufacturing, technological, and industrial productivity. And this was maintained throughout the war, right up through the Lincoln presidency. I'm not going to say any more about that. But I think it should be pretty clear to people what I'm talking about. Now, there were a lot of other initiatives. During the war, thousands of miles, probably tens of thousands of miles of telegraph wires were built. All kinds of new industrial processes were brought online. New revolutionary industrial processes were discovered and invented. One of these was the Bessemer steel process, which was the most advanced way of making steel in the world up to that point. This was discovered. This began to be integrated into steel production. Many other things were done. Mass production, standardization. By the end of the war, we had built up the most advanced, the most powerful, the most scientifically advanced and productive manufacturing and industrial economy in the world, in the history of the world. And it was all done through the credit system that Lincoln had established, through the initiatives he had made around the tariff, the Department of Agriculture, the Transcontinental Railroad, the flow of credit through the greenback policy and the national banking system into manufacturing, into all walks of life. This was created. This was built up. This was a Hamiltonian policy. It was done in Lincoln's time. We can do it again today, to recognize the sovereign power of our government to act in this way. Now, what I want to do, what I want to get to, and I'm obviously leaving a lot out of what was built and what have you, and all the various projects, and people can people can write in about that if you so choose. But I'm shortening this this section on the projects that were built, because I want to get to really, in some ways, what's the central focus of this podcast, which is the question of a science driver policy and the question of Lincoln and science. In 1863, Lincoln signed a bill into law creating the National Academy of Science. Now, this had never existed before. There were private things. There was the Franklin Institute. There were other things, which had done very, very good things, very important things, but never a government-sponsored, government-funded science academy. Lincoln signed that into law in 1863. Now, a lot of people do not know of Lincoln's interest in science, or if they heard of it, they don't realize how deep it was in Lincoln himself. We discussed in earlier podcasts how Lincoln had studied the law, and really he turned himself into a premier lawyer by the 1850s, and he did this on his own. And he also studied economics in the 1840s and 50s. And he became an expert, one might even say a genius, in economic policy. Well, it's sort of far less well known that Lincoln had developed a really serious interest in science. And he studied it over many years. And as he got older, his interest actually deepened. And he became a serious student of scientific matters. I don't know when this began exactly, but I know from a fairly young age, he was a subscriber to a magazine called the American Journal of Science. This had been set up in 1818 by a man named Benjamin Silliman. And in fact, the magazine was generally known I think the magazine still exists, but it was known during Silliman's lifetime as Silliman's Journal. That's how it was popularly known. And Lincoln read Silliman's Journal religiously. He studied it. He studied articles in it. Silliman was a professor in science at Yale University. He was, during the 1820s and 30s and 40s, one of the leading scientists in the United States. He actually worked with a number of people who established the Lyceum movement, which we've discussed before. And he was a very important guy. He was also an ardent opposition of slavery, opposer of slavery, and abolitionist. But during the 1820s and 30s and 40s, and really into the 1850s, Silliman's journal, the American Journal of Science, was by far the most widely read scientific journal in the United States, and Lincoln followed it religiously, and during that period, he got his hands on as many scientific books as he could. And between his law practice and being in the state legislature and being in Congress and all of the things he was doing and setting up the Republican Party, he would find the time to delve into these scientific books. I can give you the names of two of them. In 1844, I know he read a book entitled Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation by a man named Robert Chambers. And then in 1850, 6 years later, he read a book called Annual of Scientific Discovery, written by David Wells. And he praised that book, telling Herndon, his law partner, that I have wanted such a book like this for years. Now, these were serious books. These were, books designed and aimed at an audience of other scientists, people who were delving into serious scientific matters. And Lincoln was studying these things and trying to get to the heart of some of these scientific questions. As I said, in 1863, he established the National Academy of Science. This was legislation that he pushed for, that he fought for, that he was determined to get passed. And if you look at the founding legislation of the National Academy of Science, what it says is that the National Academy of Science is charged, quote, with providing independent, objective advice to the nation on matters related to science and technology, to provide scientific advice to the government whenever called upon by any government department. So this is what was set up. Now, I'm going to, what I want to do next is tell you a little bit about this National Academy of Science. But before I do that, I want to take a drink of coffee because my throat is getting a little parched. All right, we're going to leave this on the screen a little bit. As you can see there, the most prominent figure is Abraham Lincoln. And this is a painting of Lincoln with the directors of the National Academy of Science. And I believe I have them in order. If I make a mistake, I apologize. But going from left to right on your screen, the first person is Benjamin Pierce, and he was the head of the Harvard Observatory, which was the premier astronomical observatory in the United States at that time. The second person from the left is Alexander Dallas Bache. Now, Bache he graduated first in his class from West Point. He was a leading scientist for many, many years. In 1843, he was appointed the superintendent of the United States Coast Survey, and he transformed it into the foremost scientific institution in the country before the Civil War. In the 1840s and 50s, he developed a network of scientists based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who became known as the Lazzaroni. And this was really the leading group of scientists in the United States in the mid to late 1850s. He became the leading figure of the National Academy of Science. If you want to say, well, anyway, I'll leave it at that for now. I'll say more about him in a few minutes. The third person from the left is Joseph Henry. Now, Joseph Henry had been earlier named the first head of the Smithsonian Institution. He began experiments in electricity in 1826 in Albany, New York. He worked on those experiments for a number of years. He later moved to Princeton, New Jersey. In Princeton, he became acquainted with Alexander Dallas Bache. He served as the first secretary of the Smithsonian Institute. He did revolutionary advanced work in investigating electromagnetic phenomenon. He was really the inventor of the telegraph, not Samuel Morse. Morse took the discoveries that Henry had made in electromagnetism and then from them formed a workable electrical telegraph. The next individual, the fourth individual, the one I think there with the bow tie standing next to Lincoln, is Louis Agassiz. He was actually from Switzerland. He emigrated to the United States. He was a biologist. He was fiercely committed to advancing American science to a world prominence. He developed the theory of the ice ages. He was based in Boston, worked with Bache and the Lazzaroni in Boston. He was also a lifelong opponent of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Then you've got Lincoln. Standing next to Lincoln on the screen on Lincoln's left, but on our right is Admiral Charles Henry Davis. He was an admiral during the Civil War, actually he was a war hero. Before the war, he had built up the Naval Observatory in collaboration with Benjamin Pierce at the Harvard Observatory. He was involved in fundamental astronomical scientific research, and Davis actually translated Carl Gauss's treatise on the discovery of the orbit of Ceres from German into English, and was working intensively on many of the discoveries that Carl Gauss had made. Next to Davis is Benjamin Gould. Gould is another astronomer. He had studied in Germany. He was befriended by Alexander Humboldt. Humboldt introduced him to Gauss. He actually lived for a time in Gauss's home and studied mathematics and astronomy under Gauss. He obtained a PhD at Göttingen University, and in 1848, he was offered the chair of astronomy at Göttingen University at the observatory there, but he refused it because he instead returned to the United States, where he created a magazine called the Astronomical Journal. And the reason he returned to the United States was he was committed to putting the United States in the forefront of astronomical science, of astronomical observation. So as you can see, you're dealing here with people who, in their own right, in their own fields, in biology, in astronomy, in geometry, in many different fields, they are both the leading scientists of the day in the United States, but they are dealing with the most advanced problems in science, in electricity, in electromagnetism, in astronomy, and in other areas that scientists in Europe, that Gauss and Humboldt and others in Europe, Faraday and others are dealing with. And these are the people who Lincoln recruits to become the directors of the National Academy of Science. Lincoln did not pick these scientists and work with them because of their political views. I mean, several of them had real problematical political views. A few of them were pro-slavery. Joseph Henry, one of his closest friends and allies was Jefferson Davis. And actually, when Davis got elected as the president of the Confederacy, Joseph Henry sent him a letter congratulating him. So these people were, that is not why Lincoln chose them. What Lincoln is looking at here, really, it's two things. One is his commitment of creating a National Academy of Sciences, which is going to propel the nation forward, which is going to use Lyndon LaRouche's term, lay the basis for creating science drivers, discoveries, a science driver approach towards the development of the nation. But at the same time, what Lincoln is looking at is the question of science itself, because this is where Lincoln himself is developing a very profound interest. And what I'm going to describe to you next is really quite remarkable. In 1834, Carl Gauss and Max Weber had created a magnetic union in Göttingen to study the Earth's magnetic field. And they set up observatories and, around the world, actually, even in Siberia and, various places, to study the Earth's magnetic field. And this involved a lot of things, because the Earth's magnetic field is incredibly complex. And the interactions and how it works and all of this. And it involves spherical geometry. It involves harmonics. You're getting at fundamental questions of science. Now, during the Civil War, Joseph Henry set up a magnetic room in the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, where he was going to study these same phenomena, where he was going to study magnetic and electromagnetic phenomenon. And if you can just put up, Mike, the picture of that room. Now, this doesn't tell you a lot. And I don't claim to understand this diagram completely, but it's essentially just a rough drawing of the room. And as it says, it shows various magnets, gas lamps, photographic recording cylinders. And I am not going to try to explain how this worked, because I do not know how it worked. But it gives you some sense of the room he was setting up where they're recording this, they're measuring it, they're using different electrical setups, different magnetic setups, and they're studying these magnetic currents, these magnetic fields. This was the magnetic room that Joseph Henry set up in the Smithsonian Institution during the war. And this is all under the auspices of the National Academy of Science. Now, what actually occurred, you could take that drawing down, Mike. What actually occurred, in 1864, 1865, is that Lincoln would go over to visit Henry in this magnetic room. And he went there quite a few times. And Lincoln actually became involved in these experiments where he was working with Henry, setting up the various, equipment, conducting the tests, where what you're looking at here is literally frontier work in the area of electromagnetism being conducted in Washington, D.C., in which the President of the United States himself is working in that laboratory, helping set up and carry out those experiments. Now, I don't think any president in the United States has ever played that role. And the way one person who was there in the room wrote about this afterwards is he said, Joseph Henry was the only physicist who had a sitting president as a lab assistant. Late at night, Abraham Lincoln often assisted Henry with his lab experiments. And during that same period, Lincoln wrote a letter to a journalist, a man named Charles Coffin. He wrote Coffin a letter in which he said, and this is a quote from that letter that Lincoln wrote, "My visits to the Smithsonian, to Dr. Henry, and to his able lieutenant, Professor Baird, are the chief recreations of my life. These men are missionaries to excite scientific research and promote scientific knowledge. The country has no more faithful servants, though it may have to wait another century to appreciate the value of their labors." So he's saying that, he's describing the work he did, creeping away late at night, leaving the White House late at night to go over to visit Henry in the Smithsonian, to go into the magnetic room, to work with Henry setting up and conducting these experiments. He's describing this as the chief recreation of my life. After getting battle reports, after getting lists of casualties, after being engaged in a fight in Congress to get a bill passed, or getting reports from one of his generals who maybe lost the battle, Lincoln, sneaks away, so to speak. I don't think he snuck away, but sneaks away, so to speak, to go into the laboratory with Henry to work on a scientific experiment. I mean, when I read about this, I was just astounded that this is the kind of president Lincoln was. This was the kind of person Lincoln was. And this went on throughout his presidency. And I could tell you that I mentioned that Joseph Henry had been, essentially had some Southern sympathies and had, been friendly to Jefferson Davis. But at the after working with Lincoln in these experiments, Henry developed this deep admiration for Lincoln. And in 1863, he wrote to a friend of his, the most far-seeing head in the land is now on the shoulders of that awkward rail splitter from Illinois. So this is the respect that Henry had for Lincoln as they worked together during those years. There's a lot more that I could go through in terms of the science work and things like that. But I think what I want to just sort of end with here is the 1876 exposition in Philadelphia. This obviously occurs 11 years after Lincoln's death. But if you look at all of this, if you look at the National Academy of Sciences, if you look at the work Lincoln was doing with with Joseph Henry in the magnetic room, if you look at the Transcontinental Railroad, if you look at the Department of Agriculture, the land grant colleges, if you look at all of these things, university education, if you look at how the credit system was deployed, that we discussed in some depth last week, the sovereign credit system, how they created a flow of money into building new industries, into creating new inventions, new discoveries. If you look at this engine of development, as I said at the beginning of this, the subject of this podcast tonight is the economics of development. And if you look at this, what was unleashed during the Civil War, and then what exploded in 1866, 1867, 1869, 1870, 71, 72, what exploded was a productive economic leap upward, the likes of which had never before been seen. And in 1876, on the 100th anniversary of the signing of the U.S. Declaration of Independence, a centennial exposition was organized in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, both to celebrate that 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the way in which that commitment to the Declaration of Independence had been defended and rescued in the Civil War, but at the same time to look to the future, to look forward to the next century by putting on display the incredible scientific and industrial productive economy that had been created, in those years. So to just give you some sense of it, the 1876 exposition was convened on May 10th in 1876, and it closed on November 10th. So its doors were open for 6 months. It went on for 6 months. During those 6 months, there were 10 million visitors to the exposition, 10 million visitors. Initially, a lot of these came in. There were almost 200,000 visitors on the first day. And initially, a lot of these came in from close by. It was in Philadelphia. And they came in from Philadelphia, or maybe from New York, or maybe from New Jersey, or maybe from Maryland. But then as time went on over the 6 months, because of the railroads, because of the canals, because of the things that had been built, They started coming in from Ohio, from Wisconsin, from Minnesota, from Chicago, from Kentucky, from the South. They came in from all over the country, from Texas. And this became a national celebration, a national exposition. They built 5 giant halls. These things were huge. The largest one was the main exhibition hall. It was 1,900 feet long, and I don't know how wide it was, but there were 30,000 exhibits in it. Over 37 foreign countries had exhibits. There were exhibits on all kinds of businesses, all kinds of machinery, all kinds of agricultural goods, all kinds of things. 30,000 exhibits. Then they had the what was called the machinery hall, and this was the second largest structure. It was 1,400 feet long, 360 feet wide. It occupied 558,000 square feet. There were 2,000 exhibitors in the machinery hall, but this held a lot of machinery, big machinery, bigger machinery. Some of the most, the most recent. I mean, people who might have invented something within the previous 6 months or the previous 9 months, brought that invention to Philadelphia and put it on display. Things people had never seen before. Things that most people had no idea even existed were put on display. The opening ceremony was attended by President Ulysses Grant, as well as by the Emperor of Brazil, Emperor Pedro II. And this was the first time a foreign head of state had ever set foot, on American soil. The first time that ever happened. And they had the opening ceremony, and the opening ceremony was conducted in front of the Corliss steam engine, which was in Machinery Hall. And if you could put those final 2 pictures up on the screen, Mike. This is just, I believe, the one on the right is the main hall. I think the one on the left, that might also be in the main hall. I'm not sure, but these show you part of the things, but some of what was exhibited and what have you. But then go to the next picture. Yeah, this is the opening ceremony. And it's a little hard to see, but you see someone with their hand in the air. I believe that's Emperor Pedro. And then standing to his right, I think on the other side, his right, not our right. No, I think the guy leaning backward, or maybe it's the guy standing up. One of the 2 people on the right, it's a little hard to see, is Ulysses Grant. But behind them, you can see this huge crowd. But behind them is the Corliss steam engine, which dwarfs them. And this is the largest and most powerful steam engine that had ever been invented up to that point. And it's put on display in the hall, essentially sort of to say, this is what we've created. This is the productive power which is now at the disposal of our republic. This is the productive power that we can bring to bear to advance the condition of the human species, to advance our own nation, and to advance the cause of all mankind. So you could take that off the screen. Now, I'm not. That pretty much concludes what I wanted to go through. But what I am gonna conclude with is, I've given you the presentation. But people say, well, what's the relevance of this for today? Well, I could tell you that Donald Trump thought it was relevant. And I'm going to read to you from a speech that President Trump delivered to a joint session of Congress on February 28th in 2017. So he was sworn in January. So this is a speech that he delivered to Congress. Really, he had been in office probably no more than a month, joint session of Congress. And I'll read to you a few paragraphs from his speech. He says the following: in 9 years, the United States will celebrate the 250th anniversary of our founding. 250 years since the day we declared our independence. It will be one of the great milestones in the history of the world. But what will America look like as we reach our 250th year? What kind of country will we leave for our children? Looking backward, on our 100th anniversary in 1876, citizens from across our nation came to Philadelphia to celebrate America's centennial. At that celebration, the country's builders and artists and inventors showed off their wonderful creations. Alexander Graham Bell displayed his telephone for the first time. Remington unveiled the first typewriter. An early attempt was made at electric lighting. Thomas Edison was there and showed an automatic telegraph and an electric pen. Now imagine the wonders of our country. Now imagine the wonders our country could know in America's 250th year. Think of the marvels we can achieve if we simply set free the dreams of our people. Cures to illnesses that have always plagued us are not too much to hope. American footprints on distant worlds are not too big a dream. Millions lifted from welfare to work is not too much to expect. And streets where mothers are safe from fear, schools where children learn in peace, and jobs where Americans prosper and grow are not too much to ask. When we have all of this, we will have made America greater than ever before. For all Americans, this is our vision. This is our mission, but we can only get there together. We are one people with one destiny. We all bleed the same blood. We all salute the same great American flag. And we are all made by the same God. When we fulfill this mission, when we celebrate 250 years of glorious freedom, we will look back on tonight as when this new chapter of American greatness began. The time for small thinking is over. The time for trivial fights is behind us. We just need the courage to share the dreams that fill our hearts, the bravery to express the hopes that stir our souls, and the confidence to turn those hopes and those dreams into action. From now on, America will be empowered by our aspirations, not burdened by our fears, inspired by the future, not bound by the failures of the past, and guided by our vision, not blinded by our doubts. So that was Donald Trump. And that was not a campaign speech. That was a speech he delivered to members of Congress, basically asking them to look at the world in this way. And that is the American system in action, which is the title of our presentation tonight. That is the economics of development. That is a science driver approach, as Lyndon Larouche discussed it, towards creating and building and revolutionizing our economy and creating and building a productive future. So that, I think, is how I'd like to end it tonight, Mike.
Yeah, that's great. It's actually somewhat just extraordinary, like you described it when you first encountered it, to think of our president in the midst of really what was an attempted hostile takeover of the country, both to break it into pieces, but also to basically to put all of it into massive amounts of debt controlled by London Wall Street banks. As you described the last time, there was his own Treasury Secretary was ready to basically accept the massive usurious and the control of London and Wall Street banks to just basically get the money to fight the war. And if that would have been the case, would they have gotten any money at all in 1863 or 1864? I mean, that's in 1861. And so he's dealing with that angle of it. And then he's got to fight the war, find generals. We haven't even discussed that question. I don't know if that's in the later podcast, but certainly just it's somewhat popularized, the struggle to find generals who would execute the war in a way that would win the war, that would end the war, rather than fighting fair or whatever, however they might have thought of it. And to launch these various economic initiatives, but then as you went through, but then to spend his recreational time looking at electromagnetism. It's just such a striking intersection in the course of human history that's unparalleled. And it really is extraordinary. And it's hard to even ask questions about it, frankly, because it's just kind of it's so unprecedented that it's the fact of it itself. It's not so much any of the details. So maybe you just want to say more, yeah.
Well, one thing is that, again, not everyone who is watching this saw the previous podcasts, but we did have an earlier podcast on the question of Abraham Lincoln and education. Excuse me. And it wasn't just that Lincoln wanted people to be able to read and write. He did. I mean, there was, illiteracy was widespread, particularly in these, in the poorer rural areas, but also among a lot of people. Or if they didn't know how to read and write, they, knew how to, maybe just barely. That wasn't Lincoln's commitment to education was not to simply give people the rudiments of what was necessary. It's not like, let's teach kids today enough so that they can, work the cash register at McDonald's, or
even type code.
Or even type code, exactly. Lincoln's approach was always that, inside the mind of every person, there's a creative power. I mean, again, the danger is it becomes trite, but if you think about it seriously, it never becomes trite in the way that Lincoln talked about discoveries and inventions being the basis for all human progress. And all discoveries and all inventions flow from human beings, and they flow from the creative capabilities which exist in human beings. And the purpose of education is to nurture and develop and to try to bring out those potentialities within people, within young students or young adults, within everyone. This was Lincoln's identity. This was who Lincoln was. And it was never just about, as I said before, let's build a canal, or let's build a railroad so that people can make some money off it, or that, farmers will have water or a way to get their crops to market, and so the farmers can prosper. It was never just about that. Those considerations are important. But you're not building a productive economy for the sake of a productive economy. You're building a productive economy for the sake of advancing the population. and Lincoln always said, you need to advance the population materially, intellectually, and morally. Um, this is what you're doing. And not only was Lincoln fighting for these things, not only was that his commitment, which was also the basis of his hatred of slavery. But not only was he fighting for this kind of approach, but that's who he was as a person himself. The way he taught himself law, the way he taught himself economics, the way he taught himself. I mean, he was reading in the 1840s the most advanced economic works he could get his hands on. He was reading the most advanced scientific treatises he could get his hands on. And this was who he was. And he also recognized that this is the basis for society. This is what you would like. I mean, you're not going to have utopia, but that this is what you would like every person to have the opportunity to develop and advance in these ways. Whether they study physics, whether they study music, whether they study astronomy, whether they study engineering, that everyone has to have the opportunity to develop these powers of the mind. And Lincoln, that's who Lincoln was. I mean, it is incredible. I mean, he wasn't just some, the one guy said that Henry was the only one who had a sitting president of the United States as a lab assistant. But, which in and of itself, the image of that is quite startling. But Lincoln wasn't just some lab assistant who stood there like a dummy. He intensively followed all of these experiments. He was involved in them. He was talking to Henry. I mean, he says in the quote he wrote in that letter to the reporter, this was my relaxation. This was my fun. This is what, he did. I'm changing the wording now because I don't have the quote in front of me, but this is what he was excited about. And it's truly remarkable. It's truly remarkable. I mean, you really see, in Lincoln, I don't even know how to put it. I mean, you could say you see, Lyndon LaRouche's 4 laws embodied in everything Lincoln did and everything he was as a person. But that's just putting a name on it. It's just, it is truly extraordinary. I don't know how else to describe it. And you could see, the effect of this on other people. Like I said, Trump said in his speech, the Remington typewriter, Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, other inventions. Edison was there. Alexander Graham Bell was there. Remington was there in 1876. Edison was there. Lots of other people were there. Not only, 10 million people who visited the fair, but thousands and thousands of scientists and engineers and inventors were there. And they were bringing these inventions in. And this is what Lincoln unleashed. This is what's possible for the nation. This is what you can unleash. And people say, well, we couldn't do it today. I mean, Lincoln is fighting a civil war where it's not even clear if the nation is going to exist. And he's doing this. So, of course, we can do it today. But you think of the creativity that was unleashed by these initiatives from Lincoln. People in the Department of Agriculture, people in the agriculture, in the land grant colleges, studying plant diseases, studying seeds, studying crops, studying hybrids, studying irrigation, revolutionizing food production. As Lincoln said, if we can produce 2 blades of grass as opposed to 1 blade of grass It's a stupendous thing. This is the orientation. None of it is about money. I mean, last week we discussed, the sovereign credit system versus the money system. Nothing that Lincoln is doing is about money. None of it is about money. It's all about unleashing human creativity.
Yeah. I mean, it stands out. I mean, you look at this course of American culture from Benjamin Franklin's early electrical experiments in the 1740s and 50s, and then taking those over to Europe and really provoking and inspiring what became then this Gauss, Weber, Riemann whole school of thought of asking these kinds of advanced theoretical questions. Ultimately, it leads into Einstein's work, where we get nuclear power. And Abraham Lincoln is directly engaged in that kind of process. When you think of, when I think of this question, we talked a lot last time on sovereignty, as you mentioned. When you think about the question of national sovereignty, when you look back and read, especially Hamilton's writings for the Federalist Papers, it's clear that the premise of national sovereignty, the viability of it, or its legitimacy to have a sovereign government, is the identification and respect for the sovereignty of the individual. That without the sovereignty of the individual, there's no basis. If that's not respected and guaranteed, and again, these questions are interesting because many people would see sovereignty of the individual from the standpoint of the Bill of Rights, the search and seizure, ownership of property, these kinds of questions. But really, it's the quality of the sovereignty of the individual, which is the basis for the nation to survive, for a people, a society, or a civilization to survive. And, when you look at Lincoln in this case, especially in this discussion today and what you presented, because there are so many aspects to take up the bigger projects, but the core of this quality of a person engaged in the highest levels of scientific consideration. Like he even says, it may not be recognized for 100 years. Well, it didn't take 100 years. Maybe it took, we have electrification happening in the cities early 20th century, 1910s, 1920s. And then it starts to branch out into the rural areas. And it becomes the biggest transformation of human society. But there's this quality that was possible because of an identification that the sovereignty of the individual is the basis of any nation or any society because of this kind of unique creative capacity. And that's not something you can formally define. It has to be brought to life in real terms. That's really what leadership is. It's something we've lacked for a long time, and it's something uniquely that President Trump brought, maybe in his own brash Queen's way, but he brought it. He brought that question. I mean, it's funny. We might want to talk more about how this relates to today, because that's what you just brought up. Maybe this is a segue to it, but he had an uncle, Uncle John, who was actually a scientist at MIT. In his presidency, he had an advisory panel or a board or something he put together on this question of climate change. And one of the scientists that was involved in that said he went up to meet the president, and he was asked, what was that like? And he said, well, it was a little bit surprising because President Trump was actually discussing what a cyclotron was like and how these things worked, because his Uncle John had actually briefed him back. And, I think his Uncle John worked to some degree on the Manhattan Project. And who was just discussing these kinds of things with him as a kid. And it's also partly the reason why President Trump had such a devout commitment like Reagan had, but perhaps, but where it came from which was to end the dangers of nuclear war. But I think, there's so many things to discuss, and I've just raised this sovereignty of the individual, and you may have more to say on that because you have a sense this was kind of a certain key question that really drove Western civilization, certainly at least since the Renaissance, where it became a clear idea and how it affected society itself. But there's
Yeah,
also
well,
questions of what we do with technology and science today. So yeah, why don't you respond?
well, I just briefly, without getting too much into it, I mean, people get confused about this, and then you get the people really out there on the fringe who say, and if any of those people are watching this podcast, I'd ask you to think about what I'm going to say next. You get these people who say, I'm a sovereign individual. I'm a sovereign individual. The government doesn't have the right to make me get a driver's license. The government doesn't have the right to require me to do this or that, or, I'm a free and sovereign individual. Well, if you think like that, you're just, you're wrong. You just haven't thought it through. The basis for all human advancement is individual scientific and artistic creativity, which comes from within the individual. We each have our own creative potential within our minds, within our souls, within us. We're not part of some group think. All great discoveries are made by individuals. All great masterpieces like Rembrandt or Beethoven are composed by individuals. But in order to have a culture in which that can flourish, you must have a sovereign nation state, a sovereign republic, because that is your only defense against oligarchy and empire. I mean, you take a look at what's going on today with BlackRock, with Davos, with all of these things, with all the evil things that are going on, with the massive financial and technical capabilities of Silicon Valley. All of this, can you as an individual defend yourself against those interests? Can you stand up to trillionaires and people in charge of government agencies and the FBI and foreign armies and international bankers? Can you stand up to that? No. The individual is powerless against empire, powerless against oligarchy. The sovereign nation state, composed of citizens, is the way you defend yourself against empire. And not only defend yourself against empire, but you pursue policies, as we've been discussing tonight, which will give the citizenry of the nation greater opportunity to develop their own productive power, their own capabilities, contribute their own discoveries, that the government will support that, not suppress it. And so, the question of national sovereignty is paramount to defeating empire. On the other hand, it is absolutely the case that within a republic, you recognize the sanctity and the creative potential that rests within each human individual. And those individuals then also have responsibility as citizens to defend and to promote the interests of the republic. And I mean, that may not be adequate for everyone, but that's sort of how I would put it,
And I think it's probably given what's happening with the critical race theory, what they've done to pervert science, both from the climate change, but also from the computer programming, the linear programming. But especially the critical race theory, the attempt to destroy education, both from kindergarten through, graduate school. I mean, I think that question of how do we reorient because you have to have citizens with this premise. You know, young people, even middle school, high school, even earlier, have to have a premise that this is the way their society needs to be functioning, because it's their responsibility to ensure that it continues to exist. That concept has to exist in everyone, because in some sense, like you said, discoveries are not made by groupthink. You can't have popular opinion making fundamental advancements. Why is science not based on popular opinion? Because popular opinion never made a discovery. It's not possible. You have to have people that, and not everyone's going to be a great genius in a specific area. I would say everyone has the capability of real qualities of genius, of real creative powers of thought, real courage. And they sometimes manifest in ways that people are surprised by. But you have to have a culture which supports that quality of individual breakthrough and individual discovery. That's to some extent what was the screeching banshees of our media and of the liberals who have bought into climate change and who bought into Obama and bought into this race baiting. They premise themselves on a popular religious belief, and were just freaked out by someone who just was going to be an individual thinker. But then the question comes up is actually presenting real challenges to them on a scientific level. I mean, the space program is an unlimited potential. It really is the transcontinental railroad, but it could just keep going. I mean, if we really commit to this, there's no places we can't go. It's also clear, you really wonder. I was thinking this, and maybe this is not what you said was so profound, I think, and important. I just wanted to put the context on it, why what you just said is so important. And the political course of the dialogue in our country today, and it really in our civilization. It's really beyond our nation. This fight for sovereignty exists and has throughout the Americas, throughout Europe, throughout Asia. This question is just paramount. Africa. And it's really a question of building up a culture, because you can't just decide you're going to have self-government. You actually have to build up this quality of identity in people. But, I was also thinking, the questions of theoretical work, theoretical physics, which have really gone way off track. We keep building these huge experiments simply for the sake of theoretical physics, and they go nowhere. But the questions of fusion and plasma physics, really the kind of electromagnetic experiments of our time, it's in that area where we're going to find and make new discoveries about the universe we live in. And I just think that's striking. That's something left unsaid about pursuing something like, say, fusion energy, the next breakthrough energy platform, while we build coal and oil, while we build nuclear plants. This is a potential that's the kind of thing that Abraham Lincoln would thrive on. It's why Lyndon LaRouche pushed it so hard, because it's really the most fertile ground, because it's through the breakthrough of advancing human civilization that in that process, just like the electromagnetic work, opened up the questions of Einstein in a whole different universe. I mean, we didn't even know that multiple galaxies existed when Einstein developed special relativity. It's hard to fathom. And so, these kinds of questions are right there. And I think part of what's lacking is a scientific community that sees that identifies the political fight around real science is not separated around the political fights for mankind's development in this country. And that was somewhat, they've become too sheepish or cowardly. We saw this on COVID, where a lot of them thought differently about certain aspects of the response to the coronavirus and didn't say certain things. But emboldening them, I mean, Lincoln was bringing in scientists who are basically supporting Jefferson Davis and slavery, and says, look, we're gonna advance mankind. We're gonna do it. But and he's recruiting people. I mean, like Alexander the Great, you're going to recruit people that think differently, but say, look, if you take it from this greater perspective, you bring the whole thing to bear. That's what Lynn saw. Lincoln clearly saw that. I think Trump clearly sees it. We've just got to get more people to start understanding how this thing can be pulled together. Because as bad as Lincoln faced it with the Civil War, I say our culture today is actually far more perverse in certain ways. But nonetheless, it can be done. The obstacles are far less than what he actually dealt with.
Yeah.
So I don't know, Bob, if you want to say some things, and then we'll see where it goes.
Boy, we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, we could wrap it up. I mean, I think what you really said at the end there was really, to me, just so critical for why how Lincoln embodies the true idea of an American citizen.
Yeah. Why don't we end on a high note? Why don't we wrap it up?
Sure. Do you want to give people a sense of what's to come?
Well, the next one is, we've had like a two-fisted punch here, greenbacks, national banking, and the American system in action. So we're going to skew sideways a little bit next week, and we're going to have a presentation entitled Humor, Metaphor, and Shakespeare.
All right, Rich.
And that might you might get a kick out of that. As to the thing that you said about the war, the generals and all that, I was not planning to do a presentation on the actual war or the generals. I mean, because that's just something that people, know a lot about, a lot of people. And I didn't see any reason to go back over that ground. But we could see. We'll see how this develops. There's still 2 or 3 more that I have planned, and who knows? This could become a never-ending project. So,
well, we will have it'll be a finite podcast, but it probably is a never-ending project. So, if more people can realize it's never-ending, then we'll actually start to build our republic again.
Right. But anyway, next week, humor, metaphor, and Shakespeare.
All right. Sounds wonderful, Bob. Thanks for spending the time doing this. And thank you to the audience for subscribing, supporting Larouche PAC, sharing this with friends and family, and helping to educate a citizenry and inspire the next generations of Abraham Lincolns. All right, Bob, we'll talk to you next week.
Okay. Bye. See you then.